when life is going to set in on you and change your circumstances. You got to be careful how you treat people. Amen. 2 times the Bible says you honor your parents, and that simply means you honor them when you're young and when they get old. Amen. You owe them an honor. You got to give them the best life and to let their older days be their better days. So pray for Mama. Pray for the Calvert family. Pray for Kevin Cannon's family. And I'm live on Facebook now. I want to announce our Vacation Bible School. That's going to be the week after the second Sunday, 3 nights. And we do want to invite the public. This is a public Vacation Bible School. It's going to be held here at Siloam Baptist Church nightly at 6 o'clock. We're going to be feeding the young people, and we're going to be having classes, breakout classes, and then we're going to get together during that Vacation Bible School. And we want to invite the public to come and be a part of our Vacation Bible School on the second week of July, the week after the second Sunday, the week after our convention that will be held in Starkville, Mississippi at the El Bethel Baptist Church, Pastor Carlton Fisher. We want to extend an invitation to the community, the Siloam community, and hopefully if things work out, we'll be providing transportation, and I'll put that on our Facebook page, who you can call if you need transportation to our Vacation Bible School. I want to now go to our text. I am a little tired. I'm always tired. I got people pulling me in 100 directions, and it's been a very long week for me. Every week is a long week, and I've got to try to get some strength and virtue restored back in me, because I give out so much, do so much, and go so much. But I want to continue our discussion about God's plans for your life. We're in chapter 4 of the book of Exodus. Now, I've been discussing with you God's plans for your life, looking at the life of Moses. Moses has been the topic of our conversation, and I'm excited about this because now Moses is about to begin his journey of fulfilling God's purpose, God's plans for his life. God had a plan for his life, for the life of his people in Egypt. Now, God is fixing to call Moses into those plans. God's plan is to get the Israelites out of Egypt, and God is fixing to put Moses as a part of that plan to get his children out of Egypt. And now chapter 4 is an interesting verse, because if I were going to entitle this particular sermon, I would entitle it Questions and Excuses. Because in chapter 4, we're going to see the call of Moses, and God and Moses is going to have a conversation at the mountain. And now God is now speaking through the burning bush, and he's supposed to give Moses his instructions. And now Moses has questions, but he also has some excuses. And he's going to present both his questions and excuses to God. Now, it's all right to have questions, but it's unacceptable to have excuses. And God is going to both respond to Moses' questions, but he's also going to respond to Moses' excuses. But not only is Moses going to raise a question, not only is Moses going to offer an excuse, but also Moses is going to ask to be excused. He's going to ask God to send somebody else. And in this particular text in chapter 4, question, excuses, and an ask to be excused is going to be presented to God from Moses. And so that's what I want to entitle this sermon, Question, Excuses, and a request to be excused. And when God gives Moses his direction, when he has his divine encounter, now has received his divine instructions, and Moses is now going to ask God a question, give God an excuse, and then ask God to excuse him and call or send somebody else. And this is very important that we look at this, because if God has plans for your life, if God has a reason for your life, if God has a purpose for your life, you might have some questions. Amen. And you might present to God some excuses, and you might even go as far as Moses and say, God, excuse me or exclude me and send somebody else. And so I want to look at these three statements in this conversation between God and Moses. And I don't want to be long, but I want you to get this, because every person has a call on their life. God has called you to do something that is going to affect the purpose and the plans that he has for somebody else. God is going to use you in that plan, in those purposes. He's going to use you, and sometimes we have questions, sometimes we have excuses, and sometimes we want to be excused from the call or the responsibility God has for us. And so I want to look at this, because Moses is not going to just accept this call lying down. Moses is not going to accept this calling without questioning God, challenging God, and taking God to task, to ask God, is there somebody better you can send? Is it somebody more qualified you can send? Is there somebody who is more capable than me that you can send? And so I want to look at chapter 4 and read just the first verse. And I want to highlight the questions, the excuses, and the ask to be excused. I want to look at just these three verses to teach you that you cannot get out of God's plans for your life. You cannot avoid doing what God has called you to do. So Exodus chapter 4, verse 1, I want to read it in your hearing, because this is Moses talking to God. And then Moses answered and said, but suppose they don't believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say, the Lord hasn't appeared to you. You may be seated. And my brothers and sisters, everything Moses said in chapter 4, verse 1 is true and is valid. Because if Moses was going to do what God called him to do, to go to the children of Israel in Egypt, these are the questions they would have raised about Moses' presence, about Moses' commands, about Moses' mission. And so all the questions that Moses raised before God would be raised by those to whom he would lead. And what Moses said to God, but suppose they don't believe me. What is the response that God's going to say to Moses? Because Moses says, what if I go down and do what you told me to do, and the people don't believe me? They don't believe that you have sent me. They don't believe that I am their deliverer. They don't believe that I am the person you have sent to deliver them from bondage. And he asked the question, what if they don't believe that you sent me? What if they don't believe that I am your vessel? I am your instrument. And my brothers and sisters, people will doubt whether God is with you, whether God has sent you, whether God has given you the authority to do what it is you're doing. And my brothers and sisters, people will question you when you question God, because that's what is happening in the text. Moses is questioning God, and Moses is saying to God, the people are going to question me. They're not going to believe that you sent me. They're not going to believe that I am your servant. They're not going to believe that I'm your deliverer. But he not only said they're not going to believe me, but he also said they're not going to listen to me. It's one thing for people to believe in you, it's another thing for people to listen to you. Because Moses was going to give them some specific instructions. Moses was going to tell them some impossible things to believe. Can you imagine going with the message that Moses went with, and those people had been in bondage for 400 years. They haven't heard from God. They haven't seen a deliverer. And every deliverer that had ever tried to deliver them had failed. And so he's literally saying to God, they're not going to believe me, but not only are they not going to believe me, they ain't going to listen to me. Now, the most frustrating thing to anybody who's leading the people of God is when people don't listen to you. When people cannot follow the instructions that you've been given, that God is giving you to give to his people. Moses says, I'm going to get there, and I'm going to go there in your name. And I'm going to tell them that you said that I am that I am. First of all, they're not going to believe me. Secondly, they're not going to listen to me. And then when they get through saying they don't believe me, secondly, when they get through saying they're not going to listen to me, thirdly, they're going to say, the Lord hadn't appeared to you anyway. The Lord hadn't appeared to you. You didn't come to us with his message. You came with your message. And he says, they're not going to even believe that you have appeared to me, that I've been with you, that this moment that I'm having with you now, when I tell them that I've had this moment, they're not going to believe it. Amen. They're not going to believe in me. They're not going to listen to me, but they're not going to believe that you appeared to me and said all that I am saying to them. They're going to doubt whether or not I've been with you. They're going to doubt that I've been in your presence. They're going to doubt whether I have received these instructions from you. And God then responds to Moses' question, because this is Moses' question. He literally says, what if they don't believe in me? What if they don't listen to my voice? And what if they say that the Lord has not appeared to you? And so the Lord responds in verse 2. Now, what he does in verse 2 is he performs two miracles, and I don't have time to deal with them in detail. But what God is going to say to Moses, the Lord said to him, what is in your hand? And he said, a rod. And God is going to perform a miracle now in the life of Moses before he performs a miracle in the life of the Egyptians, in the life of the Israelites. God is going to demonstrate his power personally in the life of Moses before he demonstrates his power in Egypt in the presence of the Egyptians. Because in this particular miracle, God's going to do something miraculous to demonstrate to Moses that he's with him. He's going to tell Moses to throw down his rod. And the rod that he has that's made of wood is going to turn into a serpent. That's going to demonstrate that the power of God is with Moses. To reassure Moses, you're not going by yourself. You're not going powerless. And when the people see this miracle, when the people see the power of God, when the elders of Israel see the extraordinary power that I've invested in your life, they're going to believe in you. They're going to listen to you, and they're going to know that you've been with me. That's the first miracle that he's going to perform personally in the life of Moses. But he's also going to perform a second miracle. And let me tell you, the first miracle is God turning his rod into a snake. And then Moses is going to reach down and grab the tail of that snake, and that snake is going to turn back into a rod. And the second miracle is this. He's going to tell Moses to put his hands into his bosom, or near his bosom, or on his bosom, or in his chest. And guess what? Moses' hands is going to turn into the hand of a leper. And that literally means that his hand is going to turn white. I mean, so white. When a leprosy was the disease of the skin turning white. And when Moses put his hand in his bosom, it became a leper. It was leprous. And then by the same act, he took his hand from his bosom and the leprosy was gone. God demonstrated both his power with the rod and with the very hand of Moses. Now let me tell you, that's some kind of power to reassure Moses so that he could be confident in what he speaks to God's people. God can demonstrate miraculous miracles in your life, not necessarily to give people confidence, but to give you confidence. Amen. And I've got some witnesses in here that can testify God has performed some personal miracles in your life to the point where you just don't doubt God anymore. Amen. God has done some miraculous things in your life, and even when people don't believe, you believe. Amen. That's what God does in our life. Amen. He performed miracles in our lives, and in Moses' life, he performed these two great miracles, or these two great signs. And what he says to Moses, let me tell you, you think these miracles are great. The miracles I'm going to perform are going to be even greater. The latter miracles, the latter signs, these are miracles he performed in the life of Moses. That's Moses' question. They're not going to believe, they're not going to listen, and they're not going to believe that I've been with you, that you appeared to me. But now Moses is going to offer in verse 10 his excuse. His excuse was, he says, "Oh Lord, I am not eloquent. I am not a great speaker." And he says, "I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." First he gives God, he asks God a question. Now he's presenting to God an excuse. And boy, if I could stop parenthetically and explain to you, that's what most of us do. When God calls us to do something, we don't talk about the call, we talk about what we can't do. When God tells us what we can do because he called us to do it, we talk about what we can't do. My brothers and sisters, if you always focus on your can'ts, you won't ever do anything. Amen. If you focus on your can'ts, you will never do your cans. We focus on what we can't do instead of focus on what we can do. Right. And if you do what you can do, you will overcome what you can't do. And if you do what you can do, you will discover there's nothing you cannot do. Amen. No limitations. Nothing can stop you if you quit focusing on your weaknesses, on the limited things you can't do, limited things you struggle to do, if you quit focusing on your can'ts. Amen. Moses offered an excuse. Now, if the truth be told, there's 100 reasons why I shouldn't have been able to do anything I've done in life. But what I decided to focus on was what I can do. And if I do what I can do, I'll overcome what I can't do. And if I learn how to do what I can do, I'll be able to overcome some things. My son Robert Jr. asks me all the time, "Daddy, did you stutter when you grew up?" Yes, a whole lot. I got picked on in high school because I was such a stutterer, and I had to get speech therapy to learn how not to stutter when I taught. And I was very shy, and whenever they would get me to read a poem in front of the class, I would always stutter, and the students would laugh. And I would never forget reading David Henry Thoreau's poem, and I got up and I stuttered through the whole poem, and the whole class laughed at me. And listen, I went home ashamed, embarrassed, scared to go to school the next day, embarrassed to go, but I went. And listen, now the guy who couldn't read David Thoreau is now up preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, because I didn't let that one experience in Miss Smith's class traumatized me. I didn't let what I couldn't do keep me from doing what God called me to do, and I overcame my can'ts by doing what I could do and what I can do. I never gave up. And my son is stuttering now, and I tell him, don't focus on what you can't do. Yeah, you stutter. All of my sons stutter, but you can overcome it, but it does not hinder God from doing what it is he's called you to do. Excuses. He presented to God his excuse. He says, "I'm not eloquent." That was the thing he says, and I don't really have time to break it down. The three things that he says in his text about his speech, he says, first of all, I'm not eloquent. I can't use big words. I'm not scholarly. I'm not educated. I'm just a herdsman on the backside of the desert tending Jethro's sheep. And really what he was saying to God, I'm not used to speaking to people. I'm used to speaking to sheep. Amen. I know sheep language. I can talk to them and they do what I tell them to do, go where I tell them to go. I'm not used to speaking to people. And now you want me to go speak to the Egyptian Pharaoh. You want me to go speak to your people, the Israelites, the elders of Israel. That's what you want me to do. I'm not eloquent enough. Amen. My speech is not organized and sophisticated and scholarly enough. And my brothers and sisters, education might be exclusive when it comes to a career, but it's not exclusive when it comes to serving God. Amen. Because you can serve serve God and not have a communications degree. You can serve God and not take broadcasting journalism. You can serve God and not have a degree in philosophy, in religion, in theology, if God decides to use you. Amen. You don't need eloquence. You need availability. He says, I'm not eloquent, but then he says, I'm slow of speech. And really, what Moses was saying, I can't think on my feet. Sometimes my thoughts and my mouth can't get together to say what I really want to say. My thoughts are fast. My mouth is slow. I'm slow to speak. I can't think on my feet and speak at the same time. But listen, that still didn't disqualify him. God still didn't take him out of the game because he was slow of speech. But then he says, the third thing, he says, I stutter when I talk. He says, you want somebody who's not eloquent, who's slow of speech, but slow of tongue. That's who you want to send to be a spokesperson. And I really don't have time, because I'm a little tired today, to explain to you that what God was calling him to do was to be a public speaker and a leader of his people, to be a spokesman, was the very thing Moses was weak and struggled at doing. You know, God will call you to do something that you're not really good at in your own mind. But in your mind, you're not good at it. But in God's mind, you're perfect for the job. And you got to understand that God can take your weaknesses and put his strength with your weaknesses, and God can get his work done. Amen. I don't really have time to explain that to you. That God can take what you're weak at doing and put it with his power, and he can get things done. Amen. Amen. See, you think you need strength and power in order to be used by God, but sometimes you need weakness and availability, and put that with the power of God. God can do some great things. Amen. And then he asked Moses a question, and I love the question he asked him in verse 11. Who has made man's mouth? Or who has made the deaf, the mute, the seeing, or the blind? Have I not the Lord? And listen, you can take that one or two ways. You can take that as God saying to Moses, I know what you ain't because I made you. I know what your limitations are. I made you. Do you not know that I made both the mute, the deaf, the seeing, and the blind? God is saying to Moses, I know what your limitations, I know what your weaknesses are. I made you. I created you. Nobody is perfect. God didn't create but one perfect man, and that one perfect man he created messed it up, and that was Adam. Amen. Perfect. Perfect eyesight, perfect hearing, to live forever. Yeah. But he messed it up. Yeah. The rest of us are cursed by Adam's sins. Yeah. God knew every limitation that Moses had. Amen. And Moses was told by God, now you go, and I will be with your mouth and will teach you what to say. Now that's the thing. You have to realize that if you're willing to go, God will do the work. If you're willing to go, God will use your mouth to speak his words. God will give you the power to speak his instructions with your mouth. Amen. But now I gave you the question, I gave you the excuse. Now Moses asked to be excused. Moses asked to be exempt. Look at what he says in verse 13. Oh, my Lord, please send by thy hands whomever else you send. Moses did not want this job, did not want this responsibility, did not want this burden. He did not want this task. And he says to God, send somebody else. Can I be excused? I understand the calling, I understand the work, I understand the assignment, but Lord, you got to have somebody else to do this. I wish I had time to explain to you, God will never call somebody else to do what he's called you to do. You cannot be excused. You cannot be exempted from doing what God has called you to do. And let me tell you something. I don't care if you don't feel like doing what God called you to do. Can't nobody else do it. Amen. You can be 100 people, be in the room, and all of them have the ability to do what you do. But if God hadn't called them to do it, it's useless. Amen. Nobody else can do what God has called you to do. And by Moses saying this, and I don't want you to look over verse 14, and I'm closing. So the Lord's anger, so the anger of the Lord kindled against Moses. By Moses saying send somebody else, it got God hot. Because God won't accept anybody else to do what he's called you to do. God got angry. And that's an interesting phrase because very rarely is the anger of God provoked. And why was the anger of God provoked? Because Moses said, send somebody else. Why me? Why should I have to do what it is you calling me to do? I don't like it. I don't feel like I'm the right person. I don't feel like I'm qualified. I just don't feel like doing it. Let me tell you something. God could care less about your feelings. God is not worried about your comfort. He's worried about your obedience. God does not care how you feel. The Lord's anger was kindled against Moses. But God wasn't completely unsympathetic with him. He accepted Moses' excuses as excuses, and then he said in verse 14, is not Aaron the Levite your brother? And I know that he can speak well. God always got somebody to go with you. Amen. And God always puts somebody in your life to do what you can't do. Amen. To do what you struggle to do. To do what you need to be done in order to fulfill his purpose. God had this all planned out. Moses wasn't the first child that Jochebed had. He was the third child. And Aaron was his older brother, and God would use him in his plan. And I want you to notice verse 15, because verse 15 is an interesting verse. And now shall you speak to him and put words in his mouth. And literally what God is saying, and I'm going to teach both of y'all. I will put words in your mouth. You'll put words in his mouth, and I will teach you what to do. And literally what verse 16 says is the hardest thing we have to accept, especially in the context of a church. And so he shall be your spokesperson to the people. What God is saying is going to work like this. Aaron is going to go with you because he speaks well. You're going to speak to him, and then he's going to speak to the people. You're going to be my spokesperson, and he's going to be your spokesperson. I'm going to speak to you, you're going to speak to Pharaoh, and then you're going to speak to Aaron. Aaron's going to speak to the people. That's how it's going to work. The line of communication is I speak to you, you speak to Aaron. Aaron speaks to the people. I speak to you, you speak to Pharaoh. That's how all of this is going to get done. You see the people in this chain of communication, how God works through people. So he shall be your spokesperson to the people. And he himself shall speak your words. Yeah. The people are going to be instructed by Aaron. But Aaron is going to only speak what I speak to you. That's how God gets things done. God accepted his questions, wouldn't accept his excuses, and wouldn't exempt him or excuse him from his plans for his life. Now I want to tell you, how God ends this conversation. And you shall take the rod with you in your hand, with which you shall do signs. And God was saying to Moses, what you have seen is nothing compared to what you're going to see. Because you're going to go in faith. I've equipped you. I've prepared you. You have everything you need. And my brothers and sisters, I don't have time to rush and fast forward to this story. But if you think God turning that rod into a snake and healing him from leprosy that he gave him, because God gave him leprosy, and then God healed him of what he gave him. And this was a devastating disease, but what God gave him, God healed him from. But he says, if you think these two miracles were great, wait to see what I'm going to do as you go in faith, as you go and be obedient. You haven't seen nothing yet. And I want to tell somebody that if you go for God in faith, you think the little things God have done for you, the personal things that don't nobody know God has done for you, you'd be surprised what he'll do if you go in faith. Every head bowed and every eye closed. You can have questions. You can present to God excuses. And you can ask God to be excused or to be exempt. But God will not accept any of those. What God calls you to do, you have to do it. You have to be faithful. You have to fulfill your calling. You have to accept the charge